medievalist.net, and I'm here in London, Ontario today for Mapping Medievalism in the Canadian Frontier with Kathryn Brush, the curator for Mapping Medievalism. And today we're going to talk a little bit about the project and what she's doing here at the museum. So welcome. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this with us. I just had a couple of questions for you with regards to the project, and starting off, of course, is, so what's the goal of Mapping Medievalism?
Oh, right. I'm happy to answer that question. First of all, there isn't one goal, but there are multiple goals. First of all, I'm really excavating a very long period of Canadian history and visual culture that has not been sufficiently understood here by Canadians. We always think that Canadian history began in 1867 with Confederation, but instead, I'm trained as a medievalist. So for me, going back, 1867 looks just like a blip on the radar screen. I am trained to think about earlier periods, and what this project really does is argue for Canadian history and visual culture over the longue durée, which is extremely interesting. So it's creating a whole new picture of Canadian history that's much longer than we've ever thought about before. So that's novel. Also, it's a very inclusive kind of history that I'm trying to see, because I'm arguing that Canada's First Nations and their very complex cultures have to be considered as an integral part of Canada's medieval history, a history that is equivalent to that of medieval.
That was also something I wanted to sort of sidebar into, is that, could you argue that there's enough Canadian Middle Ages?
Absolutely. There are multiple Canadian Middle Ages. And I would say not only are First Nations cultures, which existed in the pre-contact era prior to 1550, so there were these cultural simultaneities between medieval Europe and medieval Canada and forms of First Nations cultures. But also I have to say that there are many other Middle Ages that have been grafted onto Canada and onto its landscape. And those would be the medievalisms that continue from Canada's real Middle Ages, that is First Nations cultures and their afterlives. But also I have to say that when the British colonizers and the French colonizers came to Canada, they were bringing many medieval influenced forms of culture to this side of the Atlantic. Even when Jacques Cartier sailed up the St. Lawrence River, which is of course named after an early Christian martyr, he was living at a time, the British too, when they first reached Newfoundland in the 16th century, that was a time of the flowering of late medieval culture in Europe. So when these people arrived, they were bringing that with them, but then when the British and French colonizers came, let's say, especially the British, to the region of present-day Ontario in the late 18th and early 19th century, they were bringing medieval institutions, parliamentary system, legal systems, and so on, which had been developed in Europe, as well as architectural. So transferring it. They were simply transferring the Middle Ages here. What Canadian culture has done is to recycle the Middle Ages. Although Canadians have not realized that.
No,
it's in the Canadian subconscious, but not in the conscious.
No, but it's nice that you're bringing attention to this so that people realize that there is actually a Middle Ages for Canada.
Absolutely.
Ignored.
It is ignored.
Unfortunately.
It is very much ignored, and unfortunately many of the narratives of Canadian history begin with the so-called pioneers.
Right.
The so-called pioneers, that's what I would call them. In fact, they were colonizers. Of course, there were very thriving cultures here around the Great Lakes and along the St. Lawrence River Valley and all of Canada, actually also in our north, during the era of the Middle Ages.
My last question to you is that the focus is on London, Ontario, and I wanted to ask you what London lends itself, how that lends itself to
Okay, London, Ontario. Why London, Ontario? Okay, this is the big $64 question. All right. Well, what's so interesting is that in the province of Upper Canada was only created in 1791 by an act of the British Parliament. The British had only taken control of this region in 1763 with the Treaty of Paris. When the first Lieutenant Governor Governor John Simcoe. And he is the one who traveled around to the various garrisons in this southernmost region of present-day Ontario, which was then the colony of Upper Canada. The British decided this was going to be the area that was most fertile, it was going to have the most potential for colonization. And so he came, he sailed along, he went overland from the garrisons at York and at Newark, came overland here. He looked at the forks of the recently rechristened Thames River, which had been earlier by the native people, it was called the Antwerp River. Then by the French, it was called the La Tranche, or the Trench. The British came to this region, then after 1763, renamed it the Thames. And what Lord Simcoe, or later Mr. Simcoe, said when he came to this and he saw the forks of the Thames, he said, "Here I'm going to build my capital of all of Canada." And so that's why this city is called London, because it was imagined to be the dream capital of all of Upper Canada. And that's why London, Ontario. The little garrison at York was never meant to be the capital. Toronto is still the temporary capital.
We were not meant to be the center of the universe, folks.
No, it was London. And London still is here. It's the new London on the Thames. It's the second largest London in the world.
There's the castle there.
And, well, no, what's interesting is that this area did remain as Crown Reserve for another 25 years. And the first building to be put up here in the new London on the Thames was a castle. It was a castle courthouse in the neo-Gothic style, built between 1827 and 1829. It is one of the earliest and most important neo-Gothic structures in the country. And what the British did was that they followed medieval practice. They have conquered the region. So as a symbol of that, they did exactly what one would do between the 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th centuries in medieval Europe. They threw up a castle. And it was a symbol of authority, but it was also a symbol of the institutions that were being transplanted here to British North America. And that's really interesting. We also have to think that this castle was erected in the middle of a forest, all right? And that follows medieval prototypes. If you look at something like the Trébuchet of the Duc de Berry, you see all kinds of castles appearing in the middle of forest and wilderness. This is exactly what happened here. So it's following exactly medieval prototypes. And the other important thing about the castle is that at the time it went up, 1827 to 29, and we'll go next door and hopefully take some pictures of it, people didn't have computers, they didn't have movies, they didn't have video cameras. What did they do? They read. And at the time, the dominant paradigm in all of Northern Europe at the time was the Gothic novel. Certainly, began in the late 18th century, people were starting to re-evaluate the Middle Ages, which was very interesting. There was a thrill in Gothic ruins. In fact, if we look at some of these watercolors here, you see these were the paradigms. There's a Turner, for instance. What's he doing? He's meditating on the ruins of the medieval past. So that was very much in vogue. But people who came here in 1827 and started to build the castle had just read Sir Walter Scott's Ivanhoe, which had come out in 1819. And of course, the star of that is castles in the forest. And so what the colonizers did was they replicated what they were reading then. That conditioned their horizons of expectation. So they came and settled in this region, or trying to colonize it, and to make it more attractive to, remember, they had to attract prospective immigrants. So they want people to feel at home. And so calling this unknown territory London, okay, is very important. That's a whole tool of familiarization. And all of the medieval townscapes that these people would have come from, even little villages, had been punctuated by medieval-inspired churches and by castles. So they're replicating that landscape here in the so-called New World, or rediscovered New World. I would say it's a rediscovered world, but it isn't really a new world, because we already had very important cultures with rich traditions living in this region.
This is really good to know that we have such a rich Canadian tradition here. Right now, we're just going to move over because Kathryn would like to show us some pieces in the collection of medieval and Canadian